Right, good afternoon to you. I come at this perhaps from a slightly different angle. I'm based in the Centre for Cultural Policy Research here at University of Glasgow, and I'm particularly interested in the regulatory framework that governs kind of in-app purchasing in particular. However, I would say that in-app purchasing is really a bit of a misnomer. You're probably aware of how the regulatory field has moved in this area. It started in April 2013 when the Office of Fair Trading, as it was then, announced that they would be investigating children's online spending opportunities. It wasn't restricted to app-based games, and in fact, the highest profile cases, of which there are only 3, 2 of those relate to kind of virtual world-based games rather than app-based games. But it's become a kind of catch-all term for what the Office of Fair Trading, as it was then, now the Competition and Markets Authority, understood to be a problem with these particular games. So their main purpose was to investigate. It wasn't a land grab process of expanding their remit. It was about applying existing legislation to new commercial contexts that were emerging. How did they go about this, the Office of Fair Trading, as it was then? Well, they did a fairly extensive literature review. They gathered complaints data, which is what I'm dealing with mainly today, and they did actually do quite a lot of gameplay. They did a lot of gameplay. Great job to have the team. They spent a lot of time looking at what the push points were in games to get I say children to spend money, but they weren't necessarily looking only at children's games. And I think this was a really important concept that they employed, that it was about games that were that appealed to children. It didn't have to be something that was specifically targeted at children. It could also be behind a firewall, for example, a game on Facebook where you're supposedly meant to be 13 or over, but they looked at the whole landscape really of games, and they had a pretty compressed timescale to do this because they were changing over to become the Competition and Markets Authority. I was part of this consultation process that they did. I researched children's media generally, and I'm very interested in kind of policy issues. So I was one of the stakeholders, if you like, that they consulted during this process, and I got exclusive access to the complaints data, and therefore what I present today isn't in the public domain. And I think it's really interesting even to sort of look at what that data is. There's 101 complaints, which wouldn't seem to me, as an outsider, an awful lot of complaints out in something that we do, I think, societally acknowledge to be a sort of problem with children's in-app purchasing. 101 official complaints to the regulator wouldn't seem particularly many. These ranged from 2.5 to 18 years old, and most of these fell into complaints from parents of 6 to 11-year-olds. The sums ranged from 79 pence to £4,000. Now, I think it's really important to say that the Office of Fair Trading were not providing financial redress to these parents in any way. They did not. Their investigation was really to find out what were the themes and issues that were at stake. So, of these 101 complaints, they were taking things like the game title, the sums involved. They were really using it very much in a quantitative sort of sense, even though it wasn't a particularly big data set. So it was a very rich opportunity for me to look at this data in a qualitative sense and look at the themes that emerged. So this idea of 45 out of 101 complaints were about poor value and unfair pricing. The questionable ethics of the in-app purchasing model, and this was the main thrust of complaints, 71 out of 101. Obviously, several complaints, most complaints addressed more than one theme. To a lesser extent, but I think it's interesting, is this idea of the third theme being relative accountability of parents and industry. A smaller number of complaints touched on that theme. So, sort of headline analysis of this, we might say that parents were unsure of how to complain. They didn't object to paying for content, but it was about fairness and proportion. But at the same time, there was often a sense of that they were paying money for nothing, an outrage that this was even possible, particularly within content that was very attractive to children. They claimed that it was addictive. So I'm just going to look at these three themes. A lot were tied up around the idea of the nature of digital products and how app-based games in particular compare to fully fledged, as they saw it, console games. App-based games were generally considered poor value for money. And that's a kind of idea of that. But of particular interest to me, I think, are the ethical concerns, this idea of exploiting the vulnerable. And interestingly, this wasn't about children being bad. This more often was about children being good, about wanting to protect their community, about wanting to make sick animals well again, etc. And I think what was really obvious was that the kind of push points of distress that could be created in these games were disproportionate to the pleasure that the game offered, and that these techniques were very, very heavily embedded within gameplay. They would exploit the desire to nurture, where if you didn't pay the money, your character literally would die on screen and follow you around your computer or your tablet, whatever you were playing with. This skeleton character would follow you around if you cancelled your subscription. And these complaints weren't just restricted to the younger age group. Another theme was really about, well, who's accountable? Parents were often very keen to set out that they had done all the responsible things, and yet their child had still fallen foul of these unscrupulous tactics. So kind of where are we now? We're years on from this. We actually only have 3 cases that have been carried forward as a result of this investigative process, this restatement of the regulations. And interestingly, those haven't been carried forward by the Competition and Markets Authority. They've instead been handled by Advertising Standards Authority because they've been seen as coming into a very narrow field of direct exhortation to buy. Now, I would argue that the principles put forward by the OFT, now adopted by the Competition and Markets Authority, could easily cover the concerns that are in the complaints data, but that there wouldn't seem to be a will to actually carry that through to enforcement. So that's just some references for you. And some idea of the principles. And I'm just going to kind of round off with this as a particular example. This was actually appended to a complaint. Most of these complaints, the 101 complaints, were a very long, free-flowing narrative. So they were a really rich source for me as a researcher. And often they were accompanied by screen grabs or particular kind of explanations. So in this instance, only one of these creatures on screen do you have to pay for in order to adopt. And I don't know, do we want to take a guess as to, if you've seen this before, it's the example I use because it is a real complaint and I have access to it. One of these creatures costs money to adopt, all the others are free. Yes? Why do you think it was the pink one? Ah, interesting. But that pink one looks quite happy and content, I would say. Yes? Why the green one?
Sorry, the grey one.
The grey one. Okay. That grey one that is sad and needs love is indeed the creature that costs money to adopt. All the others are free. So this is just an example, a sort of closing example of how deeply embedded these tactics are. And in a way, although I think the legislatory framework can cover such examples and could be prosecuted, there certainly wouldn't seem to be the political will to do so. And we've only ever had cases around direct exhortation to buy. Okay, thank you.